Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're looking at a historical entity so terrifyingly huge that its power literally eclipsed entire modern nations. We're unpacking an incredible story of ambition, global trade, and, honestly, the ultimate cautionary tale of corporate overreach.
Just picture an organization with absolute, unchecked global dominance. It sounds exactly like how we describe a modern tech giant or some massive multinational conglomerate, right? You probably picture a company building smartphones, running social networks, or maybe controlling global finance. But this organization, it didn't have algorithms or server farms. Instead, it dealt in simple, everyday stuff. We're talking spices, textiles, and tea. Yet, by using these incredibly basic goods as its foundation, it managed to become something far more dangerous and, frankly, a lot more complex than any ordinary corporation we know today.
This is the story of the British East India Company. It was a business designed entirely for profit that somehow eventually wielded the power of a sprawling empire. We're talking about a private company making life-and-death decisions that are normally strictly reserved for sovereign governments. So, Part 1. The corporation that ruled. Let's look at its humble beginnings.
The whole thing sparked to life in the year 1600. Queen Elizabeth I granted the company a royal charter. Now, the original purpose was purely commercial. British merchants just wanted in on the incredibly profitable Asian market. Stuff like spices, silk, cotton, and tea, those were generating mind-boggling profits back in Europe. So, to guarantee their success, the Crown handed them a strict monopoly over English trade with large chunks of the East. And with that, they were off to the races.
Moving into Part 2, from trade to territory. This is where we see a really dangerous evolution.
This mutation happened in stages, and it started out normal enough. You establish trading posts across Asia, you hire employees, you build warehouses. Standard business stuff. But then, they crossed a line into territory that corporations today could literally never touch. They developed their own private armed forces. Because, think about it, a business that can protect its commercial interests with actual, literal military power, that operates under a completely different set of rules.
And the sheer scale here is just staggering. We aren't talking about hiring a few private security guards. At its peak, this private business commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. These were predominantly Indian soldiers, all commanded by company officers. They had ships crossing oceans, goods moving between continents, and a military force that could genuinely rival actual empires. The massive turning point in this whole mutation arrived in 1757 with the Battle of Plassey. Company forces, led by Robert Clive, managed to defeat the Nawab of Bengal and his allies. This victory was an absolute shockwave. It instantly transformed a trading venture into a formidable territorial power. The company wasn't just trading with local governments anymore. It was actively influencing them and even conquering them.
Suddenly, this private corporation gained the right to collect taxes in Bengal. This is extraordinary if you think about it. A corporation was extracting revenue directly from millions of citizens. At this stage, trying to distinguish between a profit-seeking company and a sovereign government became almost impossible. They were practically one and the same.
Which brings us to Part 3, the cost of power, the inevitable corruption and abuse. The consequences of this unchecked corporate rule were frankly devastating, because the company was designed to maximize profit, not, care for public welfare. Corruption just ran rampant. Company officials were piling up enormous personal fortunes, while widespread reports of horrible abuse and exploitation started making their way back to Britain. And the darkest hour came with the devastating Bengal famine of 1770. That was a massive tragedy that happened squarely under company rule, and it fueled huge criticism and debate over their total lack of responsibility. This brilliantly illustrates a pretty terrifying reality. Power doesn't always arrive through conquest. Sometimes it arrives through contracts. Institutional power can completely sneak up on the world through something as simple as a trading license, a monopoly, or a global supply chain. The East India Company proved that if you give an organization enough capital, the right commercial incentives, and military protection, it can shape the world just as forcefully as any invading army.
Part 4. The empire collapses. The moment of government reckoning.
So let's look at the autopsy of this empire. After all those unchecked abuses became public knowledge, Parliament finally started intervening. The Regulating Act of 1773 was one of the first big attempts to actually increase government oversight. The company lost its complete independence, sure, but its power was still immense.
The real breaking point didn't hit until nearly a century later, with the massive 1857 uprising in India. Even though British forces eventually suppressed the rebellion, the political fallout was so huge that it broke the company's rule entirely.
Right in the immediate aftermath of that uprising, the British government stepped in for good. In 1858, they officially ended the East India Company's rule and transferred all authority directly to the British Crown. The company did linger on in a vastly reduced role for a few more years, kind of like a ghost of its former self, but by 1874, it was fully dissolved. The empire of the East India Company was officially over.
And that brings us to part 5, Lessons for Modern Capitalism. You might be wondering, why does the autopsy of a 17th century trading company even matter to us today? Well, when we compare the East India Company to today's massive tech and finance giants, the parallels are pretty striking. Both have incredible efficiency, vast wealth, and a global reach that completely dwarfs a lot of smaller nations. Today's tech platforms reach billions of people, and financial institutions move capital on an unimaginable scale. Much like the East India Company, these modern giants control the vital systems that connect producers, governments, and consumers all over the globe. However, there is a very crucial difference that keeps our modern system in check. Today's companies operate under the laws of sovereign governments. No matter how wealthy a tech giant gets, it cannot legally raise a private army. And it definitely cannot establish a territorial government to go around collecting taxes from citizens. The monopoly of force, thankfully, remains strictly with the state. Yet the East India Company still serves as a stark, permanent warning about concentrated power. It shows us how economic influence can rapidly snowball into political influence, which then solidifies into undeniable institutional power. The big takeaway here is that efficiency without accountability is incredibly dangerous. When a business outgrows its original objective, its institutional power can become extremely difficult to control.
Which leaves us with this lingering, absolutely vital question. Exactly how much power should a private organization be allowed to accumulate? And what happens when the institution created purely to serve commerce becomes powerful enough to shape politics itself? As we watch modern megacorporations continue to grow, it's a question we simply cannot afford to ignore.